Hi, good morning, everyone. So, starting with the discussions yesterday, any questions or any questions from the assignment? Can all of you hear me? If one of you could confirm, then we'll proceed. So, starting today, first we will talk about the formation and use of class in Python. In the earlier session, we have talked about function. We have seen that in the function, how to create a function, the important parts of defining a function, that it starts with def, and therefore the system knows that the moment it encounters def, it knows that now we are going to get a function. Right after def, we give the name of the function, and then after that, within parentheses, we give the parameters which will be used in the function, inside the function. And after that, as we do even in the loop operations, there would be a semicolon. And then with indentation, the next line starts with what we call as the body of the function. So in the body of the function, we define what are the different operations that would be done. And in the end, after all these operations are done, there is an optional statement called return, with which the values, whatever you define after the return statement, that would be returned back to the calling line. Today, we will see that how a class can contain multiple functions. So class is actually a package or a wrapper that you create around multiple functions, and the class will have its own data attributes. It means that it will have its own uh, data elements which can be specific to a class, and it will have its own behavior which will be defined under one or more functions. So just as we define an individual in names of certain attributes like the height, weight, maybe appearance, skin color, and things like that. And then we also define a person by his behavior and relationships. So, behavior, whether he speaks well, whether he is compassionate, whether he is short tempered, these things are the behavior of an individual. Similarly, there are two aspects of defining a class. One is the data attribute, which we saw in the function also, that we can pass on the attributes, or which we can pass on the parameters from the calling command or from the calling syntax. And those become the data attributes of a function. But in a class, also we can have its own data attributes, and different functions will define its behavior. So these are the two things that we'll define in the class. It has its own data elements and it will have its own functions. The functions can be only one function or it can be multiple functions. Now, using a class is somewhat different compared to how we use a function. In the function, when we use a function, we can give the name of the function and then we pass the parameters. And if we want to store that whatever value is returned by that function, if you want to store it, we say x is equal to, and then the function name, and then we send the parameter. The process of using a class would be somewhat different. That is, first we create an instance of the class, and then by giving the function name, that is instance name dot function name, that's how we call the function inside the class. So let's see that in the code. Just one second. Just to revisit the function, this is one of a very small function that we had created. Def is the marker that this is a function. Get a square is the name of the function. And then after that, followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we give the parameter that it will accept. So here only we need to give the name of the parameter, and subsequently inside the function, we can use that variable or whatever value is coming in by name n. And when we call the function, we have to provide that parameter. So we have discussed earlier how this parameter gets bound to the name of the parameter or the nominal parameter in the function, and this one is the actual parameter. So actual parameter is 3. This 3 will get bound to n. It means that n will acquire the value of 3. And after that, we are saying return n square, the square of n. So if we define that, and then if we call the square of 3, then it returns me 9. And the function itself, the value of the function itself, I can put that as a parameter. So first it gets the square of 2, that becomes 4. And then next time when it calls the get a square, the value is 4. So 4 square becomes 16. So that's how we define the function. This one we have seen. Now we can also have a body of the function where we can put certain other commands inside the body, and that could be a small body, a large body, depending upon what is your requirement. The body of the function can be defined. So here, in this case, we are trying to get the multiplier table of a given number. So we are asking it to first give me a table of 5. I have not defined this function here. I have not run this cell, so that's why it gave an error. Now it gives me first the table of 5 and then the table of 12. So here you see that there is a function and then there is a body. And then after that, there is a return statement. Now this return statement is not really compulsory. It's an optional statement. And when we say return, whatever is the values after that, so we can return one value, we can return more than one value as a part of the function. So today, we will extend that knowledge into defining a class. So class, as we said, is a container which contains certain data values and which will contain one or multiple functions. The functions define their behavior. So here in this case, I have defined the earlier two functions that we had defined. The function which was giving me the square of the number. So I have given here two functions. One is the function to get the multiplier table and the function to define the Fibonacci series. These are the two functions that we have worked with earlier. Now I am putting inside the class. So both of these functions define the behavior of the class. So its first behavior is that it can give you a Fibonacci number. Its second behavior is that it can give you a multiplier table. And both of these I can place inside the class. Now the class can have its own variable. And one of the things, now let's see how do we define the class. The class starts with the name class, whereas the function starts with def. After that, we give the name of the class, and then certain parameters can be given to the class. Now, since these parameters are at the class level, these parameters would be available to all the functions inside the class. So if I define a variable here, it would be available to all the functions inside the class. Second one is we need to have a function which will start with this init. So we have to give this function always, and the variable that will be or the parameter which will be passed to this function is called self. This parameter, this is a compulsory part of the class definition, and this one is used to initialize it. I talked about earlier that how do you call a function, how do you call a class, or how do you use a function inside the class. First you need to initialize, and therefore inside every class this initialization function is always required. You may or may not have anything inside that particular function, but initialization function is definitely required because that would be called to initialize the class. So if there is no other data parameter to be defined, or if there is no other operation to be done inside the initialization function, we can just say pass. It means that after defining the initialization, it will not do anything. So it will just initialize this class. When we say initialization or instantiation of the class, what it does is that with all its data attributes and the functions inside it, it creates a separate instance of it. So we can create multiple instances of the same class, and then we can operate with different parameters or different values, we can call that. And we will see that how that helps us. So in the process of defining defining a class, we start with class, we give a name, and then we define certain parameters inside the parenthesis. Next one is we define a function which has to take this form, function underscore underscore init underscore underscore, and it will take a minimum of one value, which is called the self. And after that, I can have some operations to be done. which is optional. So in this case, we are defining a very simple function. So I am saying that no operation after initialization. So it will pass. Now, whenever I call a function or whenever, whenever I want to create an instance of the class, this initialization function is the one which will create an instance of the class. So now let's see what do we mean by creating an instance of the class. So earlier, if I had to call a function, I just gave the function name and supplied that with the parameters which is required. Now, if you want to call a class or invoke any property of the class, use any value which is there inside that class, or you use any function which is there inside the class, we first create a function of the class. We first create an instance of the class, and that is done like this. So I call the class name, and then since here there is no parameter required, I can just give the blank parenthesis, and then this one creates an instance of the class. Now, since we want to refer that instance over and over again, we will store that to a variable. So now A becomes the first instance of the class. Now B becomes the second instance of the class. Now, in many cases, we may like to create different instances of the class. So for example, here, now I can define certain parameters here. So for example, here we are using A and B and the Fibonacci number. So for example, here start and end is there. So here I will define some variables. So if we define certain variables here inside, now that becomes the data property which is at the class. So having defined that, now since we are going to create different, we have the possibility of creating different instances. Whatever parameters are coming here, we'll say now we can give a name to it, self.start is equal to start. By doing this, what we are saying is that whatever are the parameters available, those are the parameters, the self word we are using, so that it gets tied to this particular instance of the class. So I can create one instance by name A, I can create one instance by name B. Now, since I have the parameters available here, I will not initialize it here. So here, okay. So here I'm just trying to demonstrate that inside the initialization function, it can be blank, or we can define certain other data elements here. So here, since we have defined that as a okay. So now there are two different elements which can be passed to this class. So these are the parameters which I don't need to pass now, because so here the parameter for the next function, right now I'm defining that as self. That means that whatever parameters are defined at the time of initialization, those things will become available here. Okay. Now we will put here as self.end. So that's the value which I will get here. Okay, so now the same thing, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the class can be defined without any parameter. And if we don't define any parameter, it will just initialize it with no class specific data values, or we can give certain parameters to the um, definition of the class. So we start with class, we give the name, then we give some certain parameters. That will be followed by the initialization function, which is a must. So now when we initialize it, the input it will take is self. So this part will remain constant. It will always be there. Apart from the self, we can give other parameters also, but here we are just defining the self. After that, we can define the data attributes. And since we are defining the data attributes, I will remove the pass. Otherwise, initialization need not really perform any other function. It will just perform the initialization function without any attributes. So both of these things are possible. The two variations that we have seen is that I define the class, I give a name, then there is no parameter. The second variation we are seeing in the definition of the class, that we can give the class, we can give the name of the class, and after that we can pass certain parameters. Next step is defining the initialization function. Now, initialization function must be there inside a class, and the purpose of that function is to create the instance of the class when the class is being called. Now, during the initialization process, I may decide not to do anything other than initialization, or I can do what we are seeing as the second variant, that we can define certain parameters. So whatever parameters have been passed, we create those parameters as the parameters of this class, and that's why we are using the name self. So at the same time, I might be having multiple classes, and therefore we are saying that these are the parameters which are the start and end are the parameters, whatever is the value is coming here, these are the parameters which will be uh, relevant for, or which will be used for this particular class, and that's why we are using the word self. Then after that, when we define the functions inside the class, it must have the one parameter, at least one parameter as self. We can give other parameters also. So when we are defining here, I am passing just one parameter self, but here we are giving self as well as some other parameter. So now let's see how do we call these functions. Just one second. First, I'll come back to you on this one. So debugging may take some time, but I'll just start with what we were doing earlier. So here it will be self. Takes one positional argument, but three here. Yeah. So here we are. I think this one should work now. MATLAB object has no attribute and method. So it is giving an error because once we say self, then it expects that that was a part of the initialization process. So I removed that because these variables are actually we will be passing along with the when we call the function. So these were the function specific attributes and not the class specific attributes. So self should not have been given. Yeah. So I'll come back to the problem that we encountered on passing the variables to a class. But a simple class can be defined without a variable. Then after that, it will be followed by an initialization function. The purpose of that initialization function is to create an instance of the class. Now, having defined this class with two different functions, or in fact, three different functions, one has to be there, which is the initialization function, and then after that, we can put different functions inside that. Now, the benefit of that is that all these functions I can package into a single class. Okay, I'll check on that, Jeevna, because the parameters can be passed because especially for inheritance, those parameters can be passed. But I'll check on that. Thanks for pointing that out. Once we come here, then we are creating an instance. And after that, if you see, let me remove that print command. So first we will call a function from inside the class. Okay. So now I refer to the instance and then I call a function. So the format would be a dot, then we give the function name, and then we pass the required parameters. Then it will first initialize the class, get me the function, get Fibonacci as the function, and then it will perform the operations which is required inside the function. So we are getting the Fibonacci number between 10 and 100. Similarly, we can call the function get multiplier table function from the second instance, which is p, and we pass the parameter. So if I comment out the first one, then it gives me the multiplication table of 8. So the purpose of why we are discussing this is that as we go along, you may have to define different functions, and all the functions which are of the same nature that we can package into one class. So so that when we have to import it, I can import it in one go. Now, why I'm also talking about this one is that we are using now extensively, especially let's see where we used this particular approach. Let's go to, I think, statistics. We use this. Yeah. So in all of these, if you see, SNS is the a class that we are importing, a class of libraries. So that will have several functions inside, and pair plot is one of the functions. So what we are doing is that SNS is a class which contains a lot of functions. Then we are defining, then we are calling the pair plot function from that particular class, and then we are giving the parameters which is accepted by pair plot. So as you can see here, that there are different parameters which the pair plot function takes, which is data, hue order, and so on. So wherever it is defined as with some default values, we need not pass necessarily, but if you want, we can pass. So for example, if you want to define, in this case, along with the pair plot, if you want to give an value for hue, we can pass the value, or we can just leave it. The value of height, default value is 2.5. If we don't give any value from our side, the height value would be taken as 2.5. If we give a value from our side, then it will be, the system will take that value and default value would be ignored. So as you can see in this command, the pair plot function, that data is a must that we should define when we are calling the function. Everything is actually a default value has been defined, and therefore even if we don't pass any value, the system will draw the pair plot. But if I don't provide the data, then it will show me an error that the required parameters have not been passed. So that is why we create the functions. So it is mainly for packaging the data attributes and different functions into a single entity. Now we can create different instances of that, and we can do the operations with those instances. So when we are calling that function and giving it a name, that is what, so if we are importing that as a library, we are giving it a name. So that name we had given as the SNS, the library name was Seaborn. So that's the process that we can use. In fact, uh, these classes then can be further grouped into libraries, and several classes of the libraries can also be used. Okay. Then we come to so practically we have seen that defining a function is a very useful tool in your hands, because whenever you want to make a repetitive use of the code that you have that you would need, that can be put into a function, so that you don't have to go and modify different parameters or write the same thing every time. The class takes that particular facility one step further, where you can group different functions and different other data attributes into a single function, into a single class, and then we can call them as we need. So we saw how to define a function. It will start with class, it will have its name. After that, there will be a closed parenthesis. How to pass different values for the class, I will come back to you on that one. We had some error coming in when we were defining. So I'll check on that and I'll come back to you. After that, it has to be followed by an init function, which will perform the initialization operation whenever we instantiate a class. That function would be called. Now, how do we use a class? So we first create an object. We said that A is equal to, and then we gave the name of the class. So that's how the instantiation is done. So if you want to use a class, we instantiate that and we create an object. So A is called the object, an object of the type, whatever is the class name. So we'll see that A, after we have instantiated A here, we'll say that now A is the object of type math underscore op. So math underscore op, that becomes a new data type or new object type. And then we say that A is an instance of math underscore op class. So A becomes an object. So we create an object, and then from that object we call the functions. So this process is called the instantiation process. Now each class has its own data attribute and the functions, and whatever different instances of a class that we create, these data attributes of the class and the functions of the class will become available to it for operation. So I said a.mathop, it means that now whatever is the original class, the get Fibonacci or get multiplier table, these functions become available to each of the classes that we operate. And data values can actually vary between two instances. I will just check on that and come back to you that why that data definition was giving me an error. Then we have seen that if you want to refer to the data element which is specific to that particular class, then we will use the self attribute, so that it is able to say that this particular data element pertains to which instance of the class. I need to come back to you on that. So we were learning about this because of two reasons. One is that we should be able to create a class by ourselves wherever it is required and refer to that. And the second is that when we are from different libraries, we will be calling different classes, and then we were trying to instantiate a function out of that. This one we also saw in the different places like scaling. We were saying that from so and so library import standard scalar, and then we were creating an instance of that. Let me come back to that particular thing because that we discussed yesterday. So scaling we discussed as a part of data munching. So if you see this concept, you will be using again and again. So here we are saying that from sklearn.preprocessing, you import all these. And then when we want to use that, we are first creating an instance of that. So for example, here, we are first calling this particular class min-max scalar. So we create an instance of that in the name scalar. So here it will just, let me show to you that how it will work. So outside this function also we can operate it. I'll just add one piece of code. And if I want to do here, I'll say, let me give some other name. X is equal to min-max scalar. And then we'll say x dot bit transform, and then we are giving it the file name. So So df I have not defined yet. So let me first go and read the files. Okay, so I have got the housing. This housing data I can't scale because it has one non-numeric field, which is the ocean proximity. So I need to first drop that field, and then we will be able to do the scaling operation. Okay, so here I have another file x, so we'll use that. Okay, now this min-max scalar, I will not do with df, I will do with scalar. So you see the process is that first we create and first we instantiate whatever we are calling from the library. And then on that instance, I can call the other function, which is the fit transform function. So since this one you will be using very often, we need to understand what is that we are doing and why are we first creating it here, creating an instance here. So it calls a function and then it is scaling the x data frame that we have given. So we are understanding the class for two purposes. One is that wherever required, we will create our own class. And the second is that we must understand that we first need to create an instance of that particular, even though we are calling a class from any other given library, we first instantiate that, and then we give the name of that instance or name of that object dot whatever function we want to call. So this is the process. So we'll discuss about the classes only to that extent today, and then we'll continue with the problem that we were trying to resolve yesterday, and that was understanding that how do you find out the relationship between two different variables. Yesterday we took the example of we have been given data about rainfall and we have been given data about rice production. So on the visual inspection, it looks like that there is the x defines y in some way. What is that way? What is that relationship? That is what we need to find out. And it can be expressed in terms of, the relationship can be expressed in terms of y is equal to bx plus c. So just to revisit some of these key concepts in regression. Regression is the process of defining the relationship between independent variable and dependent variable. So dependent variable will be one set of data. Independent variables can be more than one. But to start with, we are taking an simple example where there is only one independent variable. So that will be called the univariate regression. And if I have more than one independent variables, like say rainfall, or to that we can also use the say fertilizer used or insecticides used. So different elements we can use, and then it will become a multivariate regression. So if I have this data about certain variables based on which we are trying to predict some other variable, then we need to find out that what is the relationship which is there between x and y. And there are two key components in defining that relationship. One is a multiplier and the second is a constant. So multiplier is called beta and c is the constant. So the relationship can be put in the form of y is equal to bx plus c. What it means is that the prediction variable or the dependent variable y is equal to some multiple of the independent variable plus some constant. Now finding that, is the responsibility of us as data scientists, where we say that, okay, now these relationships look uh, appear to exist, or even in some cases, the relationship may not exist. And then we will see that how do we determine that relationship is existing, and what is the um, reliability of that relationship. And that's where we came to the concept of the RMSE, or the root mean square error, and the R squared. So RMSE tells you that how close you are, or how much is the error in that estimation, and the error we find by defining the difference between my prediction and the actual value. So that is defined as error. Again, going back to the other concept that we have dealt with, that the errors could be positive, the errors could be negative, and therefore, if we take a simple sum of that, there is we may not get the right picture, because the positive errors will cancel out the negative error, and therefore we take a square of that error, and that's where the term square error comes in. Now, since we want to find out what is the average error in many predictions that we do, so here we have 10 data points, so I make the prediction 10 times. So I would like to know what is the average error I am making, and therefore I take the mean. So I sum the error and finding out the mean. For finding out the mean, you take the sum of the entire data set, and then you divide that by the number of observations. So we take the error, we square the error, we take the average, and that is called the MSE. But since we had squared it, we need to take the square root of that, and that's called the RMSE. So RMSE actually tells you that how much error is there in my estimation. So if the RMSE is 0, it means that I have made no error. And as the RMSE increases, then we know that the error in my estimation is actually higher. The second measure that we saw yesterday was the R squared, which actually explains that in making the estimation, what percentage of the variation, or what percentage of the variance is explained by my estimator. So my estimator is Bx plus C. Now, whatever value we give to B and C, how much of the total variance it is able to explain or capture. So we know how to compute the variance. The variance is that we have done earlier. So for my prediction, if this is the prediction, so first we see that what is the variance in the data. So y is my actual data. So we can find out the variance, and for finding out the variance, you first take the mean, then you find the distance of each data element from the mean, and then we square it, and then uh, we find out the variance by dividing that by n, or n minus 1. So how much of this total variance is explained by my estimation? So if I am able to make the accurate estimation every time, then there is the entire variance is actually captured. Then the R squared, uh, the this number will become 0, and we find out the R square as 1 minus uh, this number. So that explains. So this part, see, this one is the square of the error. It means that this part of the variation we have not been able to explain, or we have not been able to capture. Okay. So 1 minus this will become how much I have been able to capture, and that becomes the R square. So uh, what we do is that the total variance is 146. The variance which I have not been able to explain, or which I have not been able to capture, that will appear as error. So if I divide 16 by 146, then we find out how much is the variance which we have not been able to explain. And then if we take the value of 1 minus that, then that shows that how much we have been able to explain. So here we saw that if we are able to predict everything correctly or exactly as it was, then the variance becomes zero. It means that what I have not been able to explain is actually zero because I have been able to capture the entire variance. And therefore, 1 minus 0. So first we find 0 by 146, that value becomes 0. So as we have seen that in the R square, you first compute what is called the uh, SSE by TSS. So SSE we are computing as this one, and TSS is this value. So TSS is nothing but our variance of the y. Okay, and SSE is the sum of the square. So here in this case it is 0, and then your R squared is 1 minus this value. Let's try to understand it, the definition part of it. The computation part, if you want, you can, you know, not keep in your memory. You can always refer to the computation, but the concept is important. The concept of the RMSE is that it tells you that how far my predictions are compared to the actual values. So how far my predictions are, we compute here in the so we'll work with these values. So let's understand what is that we are doing. RMSE, I suppose, would be clear to all of you. We are taking the error, and error is the difference between the prediction which I have made and the actual value. The R squared is somewhat difficult to understand, so I will try that once again. So all these numbers that I have for y, that has its own variance. That is what we are seeing here. So we find out what is the total variance, or actually not variance. It is one step before variance. So we take that how much is the total uh, squared value of the difference and the mean. So if you see the different steps that we follow in the variance, we compute the difference from the mean, then we take the square of it, and then we sum those squares. So that is what we call as the total sum squared. If you divide this number by, if you divide this by total number of observations, that gives you variance. Now, this one shows that how much the total variation exists, and then we find that how much is the error. It means that how much of the variation we have not been able to capture. So that is, this number tells you that 10.3% of the variation we have not been able to capture, because that is what is appearing as error. So if we subtract that from 1, that number will give me how much variation I have been able to capture. So R square becomes a measure of that how much of the variation in my prediction variable I have been able to capture. So that becomes my dependent variable. So this computation we have seen yesterday. Now we will try to see that how do we go through the process of optimization. Of course, the Google function or the Excel function that gave me the complete equation, it found out the R square for us. But in the real life, what happens is that the finding out this equation is the job of the algorithm, but we need to understand that how did the algorithm really arrive at this number. And at this point of, if we take the values at this point, then my variation will be the least. It will not become zero, because but it will become the lowest value. You can't go below that, because all the variations we may not be able to capture through our estimation. So this straight line is giving me the estimation, and we still find that there is some difference between the value at the straight line and the actual value. So that's the variation that we are not able to capture through this equation. Now the question would be that what is the process that we follow so that we arrive at an estimate which gives me the lowest RMSE and the highest R squared. What would be that process? So let's take an example here that we are trying to estimate the price of the house based on the area of the house. So suppose I have data about different houses which has the area of 5,000 square feet, 3,000 square feet, 2,000 square feet, and 2,500 square feet. And you also got the price in lakhs, which is, so the first one is 300 lakhs, which is 3 crores. The second one, the cost is 2 crores. The third one is cost is 1.5 crores, and fourth one is 75. Suppose this kind of data is given to you, and which is very close to the kind of data that we have got in our housing data set. And then if you are asked to predict that if there is another house which has having an area of 3,500 square feet, what would be the price? Okay. So how do we find out? Again, we will go back to the same process of regression. As given the data of the rainfall, as you are trying to find out what the rice production for a given year would be, similarly, given the area of the house and some past data about the price of that house, can we find out what should be the price of 3,500 square feet house? Okay. So now we will define the regression formula, which will be that what is the factor, or what is the multiplication factor, which is the beta, and what is the constant, isn't it? So suppose if we, for the time being, for the sake of simplicity, we will ignore the constant part. So if you see this data, that a 5,000 square feet house was costing 3 crores, then we say that yes, the per square feet price is 6,000 rupees per square feet. That is what the price is, isn't it? But then the first house tells me that the price is 6,000 square feet. When we come to the second one, it is different. So let's insert one column here, just for example. And we see here price per square feet. So here what we are saying, what we are observing, if you go one by one, then for this house, no, I have to give the price by this one, sorry. It is giving you 6,000 rupees per square feet. Since the price is in lakhs, this number is actually taking lakhs. So, or just so that we are able to, we're not confusing it, I'll multiply that by 1 lakh so that we see that the same price is not applicable to all the houses. Obviously, houses at different locations based on the quality of construction and several based on the floor that the house is there. The square feet rate for a given house that does vary, and therefore, whenever we'll get the data, the based on the square feet rate of one given house, we will not be able to make an exact prediction about the other houses. But here you are getting some sort of an idea that this is what the relationship between the price and the area is, and that relationship is the multiplier relationship. So here the value of b, or the beta in the function, so if we are saying here y is equal to, so basically what we are saying that y is the thing that I am trying to predict here. We will say price is equal to, which is our value y. So effectively what we are saying is that price is equal to, we will say some variable b into area, which is my independent variable, plus some constant. That is how we are making the prediction. In this case, we are saying we'll keep this part as 0, the constant part as 0. In that case, the price is something into area. Okay. Now that something in this case happens to be the price per square feet. In some other cases, it could be something else. So when we're trying to find out this relationship, we start with first trying to compute. Suppose now that we are trying to find out the estimator and the value of the b, we'll start with some value, isn't it? And then we will see that whether how much is my prediction. So if we take a value here, it is A3 into D9. So yeah, this one is the, here we will put our first estimation, and then we will see what is the prediction. So suppose by seeing this data, I start with value of say 7,000 per square feet. I'll put that in terms of lakhs, so that will become 0.07. Okay, this is the 7,000 rupees per square feet. If I put that, then I get an estimation like this here. So my actual price was for these 4 houses was 3 crores, 2 crores, 1.5 crores, and 75 lakhs. If I use the value of beta as 7,000 per square feet, then this is the value that I am estimating for these houses. And that becomes 350, 210, 140, and 175. So in some cases, I am close to the actual value. In some cases, I will be far from the actual value. And therefore, I get the deviation. And then we can compute that how accurate my prediction is. So I take the sum of these, the square of these deviations, and then I take a sum. So this becomes my sum of a square of the deviation. And then this is the number that we will try to minimize, isn't it? So if this number goes down, then I know that my predictions are actually more accurate. Now, with the trial and error, what we can do is at first I tried with 7,000 per square feet. I got a total sum of a square as say 12,700. Now I will say that, okay, this is higher. Let me try out 8,000. Okay. So if I take 8,000, my square of deviation actually has gone up. So I know that I have actually moved in the wrong direction. So if I am increasing that number, this deviation is actually increasing. So let me try with 6,000. So earlier it was 12,000, the total sum. Now with 6,000, that has come down from 12,000 to 6,000. It means that possibly I am moving in the right direction. Let's try to reduce it further. Okay. So let's make it 5,000. So I will have to express as 0.5. So if I am taking the rate of 5,000, then my deviation actually goes up. Earlier it was 6,900 something. Now with 5,000 it becomes so. Now you know that it should be somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000, because from 6,000, as I go to 8,000, then this deviation increases. As I go to 5,000, then also this deviation increases. It means that the value is somewhere in between, and we can go on doing a trial and error. So I can give 0.59, and then it reduces further because earlier it was 6,900, now it is 6,800. So I can make a trial once again and say 0.057. It means that 5,700 per square feet, and then it increases again. It means that it is now somewhere between 5,700 and 5,900. So that is how we will do with trial and error. And now we see that even at 5.8, it is giving me the same thing. So maybe it is somewhere 0.585, and that will give me the lowest deviation. So if you are doing this trial and error, after so many trial and errors, we will come to a place where even if we increase it further, this deviation will increase, or even if we decrease this number, the deviation will increase. It means that now I am at a place from where if I increase or decrease, in either case, the deviation starts rising. It means that that's the most accurate uh, value for our regression, or the value of the beta, or the value of the b. Is this part clear to you, that how, if we have to make the best estimation by trial and error, how do we go about? And then we will see that how the same thing can be done mathematically. This part is very important to understand, because in most of the optimization algorithms that we learn, this is the trial and error which even the system does. Because finding out an equation as we did is not always possible in the multiple scenarios, because here this line can be drawn as a straight line because we are talking about only two dimensions, x and y. But as we have seen that our data could be having multiple dimensions, and therefore that a straight line just doesn't work, we will have to resort to the trial and error method. And that's why, for the sake of understanding, I am showing you that how, if we were not really doing it mathematically, but if we are doing it as a trial and error, what would we do? So we start with some number. So here we start with, say, we started with 7,000 square feet, and we saw that there is a large amount of deviation. Then we say that, okay, let me try with 8,000, the deviation increases. It means that as I go from 7,000 to 8,000, deviation is actually increasing. And therefore, I will try to reduce it and see what happens. Now the deviation decreases. It means that possibly it could be even lower than 6,000, because as I went from 7 to 8, deviation increased. As I came from 7 to 6, deviation decreased. It means that maybe I'm moving in the right direction. Then we tried with, say, let's try with 0.04,000 square feet, and then we see that deviation again increases. So as I go up from 6, deviation increases. Now at 4 also deviation is higher. So let's try that. If I reduce further, to 3,000 square feet, deviation further increases. It means that from 4,000, I need to increase, and from 6,000, we need to decrease. And therefore, we'll put somewhere between 4 and 6, we are putting 5,000. So deviation comes to 10,000. So this is how we will do a trial and error. And at whatever point my deviation is the minimum, that becomes my best estimate. Now that is what the algorithms also will do, and that algorithm is called the gradient descent algorithm, and we will understand that what is that algorithm. And uh, this part is a very important part of the all the algorithms that we'll talk about later on. It is very important for a data scientist, a person who is doing any kind of machine learning, to understand what is this the name is somewhat complex, and we'll come to that. It's called the stochastic gradient descent. So this trial and error that we were doing, its uh, term in statistics is stochastic gradient descent, or stochastic part we'll understand somewhat later. Let's understand the gradient descent, and we will understand that what is that gradient descent and how it works. So what I have done is that at different price estimates, I have taken what is the variance. So this number, I mean, this is not really variance, but we are just taking this number, which is the sum of the variance. The variance would be if you, the total deviation would be if you divide that by the number of records that we have. So we are taking this number as what we are uh, what we would try to minimize. So we say that if this deviation is zero, it means that I have made a perfect estimation. So if I have found out some predictor which gives me the value of the first house as 3,000, the value of the second house as uh, the value of the first house as 3 crores, second one as 2 crores, then my prediction is absolutely accurate. In that case, deviation will be zero and my sum will be zero. So when this number is zero, it means that I have now made a perfect prediction. But that's not going to be the case almost any time. And therefore, we will be happy with seeing a number which is where I am able to minimize this deviation. Okay. So what I have done is that I have taken the same data for different prices. So if my estimation was that the per square feet rate is 9,000, I'll get this variance, or this number will become 50,800. If I'm making an estimation using 7,500, my variance will come to 18,900, and so on and so forth. I plotted for a lot of data points. So as you see here, that at some point of time it is decreasing, and then beyond some point of time it starts increasing. So as you can see that at 5, after something around 5,750, it means that given this data of these four houses, my estimation is most accurate when the price we take is around 5,750, because that's where the data is minimum. Now we are just taking a plot of that. We are now plotting it onto a chart. So that will look like this U curve. Okay. What it depicts is that when my estimation of the price per square feet is say 3,000, then I am getting a variance of 40,000 plus. When my estimation is somewhere around 8,800 or 8,750, again my variation is around 40,000. And as I decrease my estimate of the square feet price from 9,000, this variation actually goes on decreasing, and beyond a point again starts increasing. It means that the best estimate I receive is at this point. Okay. Now, having done this plot, we need to find out a scientific method to move from, if I make the first estimate at say 3,000, then how do we really move towards this bottom? And my optimization process should be able to find me this bottom. That is the what my algorithm should do, and that is what the algorithms would actually do. But algorithms are already available. The computation part we don't need to worry about, but we need to understand that how the system actually does the optimization. So we did the trial and error. Actually, the system also does the same thing. It does the trial and error, but the computation part, since it can do so much computation at
very fast pace. By using some very simple mathematics and calculus, it will be able to find out this uh, minimum. So that's where some of the concepts in the calculus we need to understand, and that is how, given say 2 points on a curve, how do we find the slope, or what is called as the gradient? How do we find out the gradient? So if I know that what is the gradient here, I have to move towards the point where the gradient becomes zero. So before we go into the gradient, just understand that in any of this kind of curve, at the minimum or even at the maximum, so if the curve was say inverted, so either at the minimum or at the maximum, the slope or the gradient is zero. Okay. And on the left side of this u curve, the slope would be negative. And how to compute this slope, we will come to that. Okay. But just understand this one, that in any kind of u-shaped curve, at the minimum or at the maximum, the gradient or the slope is zero. On the right side of the minimum, the gradient or the slope would be positive, and on the left side of it, the gradient or slope would be negative. So if you get a line like this, so if you have a line like this, then its slope is negative. And if you have a line like this, its slope is positive. Okay. So these are some of the basic things that we need to remember. Now, what would the system do? So suppose, just as we did in the trial and error, we take the first estimate here at say 3000. Then we'll find out that at this point, the slope of the line is actually negative. It means that I need to move, and objective is to move towards zero. So we will know that as we move to the right, or as we increase our estimation, our estimate will become more accurate. And suppose the first estimator that we took was say around, uh, we will take this number. If my first estimation was say 9000, then I can mathematically calculate what the slope is at this point of time, and we'll find that I have computed the slope also. So let's say at 8500, our slope is coming to 24, which is a positive number. How to compute the slope, we'll come to that later. But at this point of time, just remember that in any kind of u curve, you have the slope as zero at the minimum, and it will be positive if we are on the right side of the curve, and it will be negative if we are on the left side of the curve. So if my first estimation was say 8500, now the system would compute and see that the slope here is 24, which is a positive number. It means that, and my objective is to move from to a place where my slope would be zero, and therefore I need to reduce my estimation, and maybe I'll go to 8250. Then I again see there that the slope is positive there. Then I will reduce my estimate further, 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 until I come to a place where the slope becomes zero. At this point of time, we know that whether I move to the left or we move to the right, this the slope will become positive or negative, and therefore that would be less accurate estimate. So the objective of the gradient descent algorithm, which is used to find out what is the best value for our regression estimator, this is the process which is getting followed. So the system will also follow the same trial and error process, but in somewhat refined fashion. We were just doing the trial and error that 7000 or 5000, we were seeing the variance. Now, rather than seeing the variance, it will see the slope or the gradient, because I know that whenever the slope or the gradient becomes zero, that's the point where my variance would be at the minimum. And that's the point the algorithm has to find out. Okay. Is this clear to all of you? If this part is conceptually clear, then I will go into mathematics of that. Not very complex mathematics, so don't get overwhelmed by the mathematics, but I am trying to give you something which is, as a data scientist, you are expected to know. So I must go into that part of the mathematics, not very complex one. For some of you who have not done mathematics for a long time, it may be a bit difficult, but it is expected for a data scientist to know, and that's where, even if you are finding it difficult, you will have to learn it, because we are not going into a very deep mathematics or deep calculus, but very basic ones. But before we go there, I just want to ensure that conceptually you have understood that how the optimization process is run. So if one of you could confirm that whether the concept part is clear, then I will go into the computation part. Any of you? Great. So if you're clear about the concept that how this trial and error the system does, then we'll go into the mathematics of that. And the mathematics of that is that what is this gradient, and why the gradient is zero at the minima or maxima. That is something that we need to understand, and therefore we'll go into some basics of calculus. One of the interesting trivia of calculus is that calculus, is attributed to two different mathematicians. One, of course, was Newton, and the second was Leibniz, which was a Leibniz was a French mathematician. People are still arguing today that whether first it was invented by Leibniz or first it was invented by Newton, but broadly it has been attributed to Newton. Now, Newton came out with the entire concept of the calculus, how to find the integration, differentiation, and the very concept of the calculus he came out during when he was in quarantine. Just as today we are having the COVID spread all around, and whoever is getting affected or whoever wants to protect himself or herself, they are going into quarantine. It was the days of the plague in England, and Newton was quarantined in a farmhouse for more than 3 months. So he was almost alone. No need to go to the college where he used to teach, no other work. He was quarantined, and that gave him a solitary time where he could actually think on many of the issues that he was not able to devote his time to. And it is during that quarantine that he came out with the entire concept of calculus. So when we are going into calculus, we are also passing through this same time, and I hope that some of you will come out with something like what Newton did earlier. So we will now go into how calculus comes into play and how it really makes the life so much easier. Let's go into some of you would be, I mean, most of you come from the science and engineering background, so you'll be knowing about it. But just to refresh some of these things, some of the concepts. Okay. So when we say gradient or the slope, how do we find the slope of a straight line? That is, the slope is nothing but what is the change in the x-axis value because of a change in the y-axis value. So if we say move from 2 to 3 on the x-axis, there is some change on the y-axis, isn't it? So if this is the straight line that you are seeing here, as the value moves from 2 to 3, for this given straight line, the value moves from 2 to 2.5. And as you move from 3 to 4, it moves from 2.5 to 3. It means that what we are seeing is that as the uh, value on the x-axis increases, now y is also increasing with the same rate. So for every 1 point increase, and this could be the relationship between time and distance covered by a car. This relationship could be the square feet price of the house, the area of the house, and the price of the house. This could be rice production and rainfall. Okay, so the what is denoted by x axis and what is denoted by y axis is not that important for our understanding. We are just saying that there are two variables x and y. So if the line is a straight line, then this relationship is constant. It means that on this line, anywhere as we increase by 1 point on the value of the x, the value of y increases by half a point. Okay, so the relationship is constant. But if you take a curve of any shape, so we were taking the curve of, if we take the curve of this shape, you will find that this relationship does not remain constant. And in most of the cases, the relationship in life will not be really straight line. So the same, now this problem, if we extend to a curve, we'll see that as we move from 1 to 2, the value of the y-axis becomes from 1 to 4. It means that as we increase the value of x by 1, the value of y increases by 3. But in the next step, as we increase the value of x from 2 to 3, the value of y goes from 4 to 9. It means that the increase is 5. So in the first iteration, our increase was 3. In the second iteration, our increase is becoming 5. Then as you go from 3 to 4, the value becomes 16. That means that 5 becomes 7 and this 7 becomes 9. It means that the relationship between x and y is not really constant. It is going on changing. Okay. So if it is changing from between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, this change is not really in the step of 1. So suppose if I want to find out how much is the change in the value of y because of a change in value of x, not in the step of 1, but in the step of half. So as I go from 1.5, 1 to 1.5, and then 1.5 to 2, there would be change in some value, which will be possibly say 1.75, and then it will increase from 1.75 to 4. And as we go to 2.5, it will not be the midpoint of 4.9 because the rate of change is not the same. So if we increase from 2.2 to 2.5, the value is not going to be 6.5. It will be something less than 6.5 because as we see that the change in y is actually accelerating with every change in x. So then the questions that we need to ask is that how do I determine that at a given place, what is the rate of change? Because this value of y is going on changing at a different rate compared to the value of x. Unlike the straight line where this change is constant, as you move from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, for a given change in x, the change in y in this straight line is the same. But in the case of a curve, the change in y is not constant. For a given change in x, the change in y that goes on changing. And therefore, we need to find out that what is the rate of change at a given point. Because as we take a distance, say a distance or a step of 1 or a step of 0.5, that doesn't really give me an answer because the rate of change goes on varying. So if you want to find out the rate of change at a given point, then how do we find out? That is the question that we need to answer. So what is the rate of change when the value of x is 1? What is the rate of change when the value of x is 2? At this point, what's the rate of change? I know that the rate of change between these 2 points is, what would be the rate of change? We'll take 9 minus 4 and then divide by 3 minus 2. So the rate of change in y divided by the change in y divided by change in x. So in this case, if you see, the change in y is 0.5 and the change in x is 1. So between 2 and 3, the rate of change in y given the rate of change in x would be 0.5, divide that by 1.0. So my slope of this curve is actually 0.5. And as we had seen earlier, that any line of this shape will have a positive slope. Now, if I draw, say, a line like this, then as we move from, say, 1 to 2, the change in the value of x is 1. And at this point of time, we'll take the values at these 2 points. So y is, just for the sake of easier calculation, we'll take 3. And when we are at 2, the y is at 2. So for this line, which is sloping downwards here, we'll compute what is the change in y and then find out what is the change in x. So if you want to find out the rate of change in y, we will take the change in y is 0.5 and then change in x is 1.0. If you take the original line here, I'll remove that one. Then my slope is 0.5, which is positive. But if you are coming in this direction, actually the value of y will go on decreasing, and therefore the slope would be negative. So that's how we find slope. Now we see that the slope of a straight line would be constant. But the problem we have is that how to find the slope of a curve, because there it is going on changing. So between 1 and 2, if I want to find the slope, it will be 4 minus 1. So the value, the change in as I move from 1 to 2, the change in y is 4 minus 1 is equal to 3. And then change in x is 1. So at this point of time, between 1 and 2, the change is at the rate of, say, the slope is 3. But as you move from, say, between 3 and 4, it will become the change is 7. And we have the change in x is 1. So you see the slope of the line is going on changing. Between 1 and 2, it is 3. Between 3 and 4, it is 7. So next question, now I am finding out these numbers when I'm taking this step as 1. But if I take this step as 0.5, these numbers will again be different. And therefore, if we really want to find out the change at this point, so I need to find out the slope of the curve here. And that's what we are saying, that now we denote the change by using a sign of delta and all. Okay. So I'll just take 2 more minutes and then we'll continue in the session tomorrow. Now I must repeat for you that this is a very important concept in data science, that we are discussing the gradient descent. And therefore, if you're not able to understand, come back with the question, reach out to me one-on-one directly. But this is the part that you must understand. Okay. So if you want to find out the change at a given point of time, we'll use certain notations. We'll use the term delta. And delta, if we translate that into English, it will just mean a little bit of, or infinitely small little bit. Okay. So what we are trying to find out is that if I change the x with a very small amount, we first took a step of 1, going from 2 to 3. But now we are trying to say that if I change x at a very small value, what would be the change in y? That is the slope at that point of time, or also called the gradient at that value of x. So if I am standing at 2 and move a very small amount from 2 to say 2.0000 something, what will be the change in y? That is what we want to find out. And that will be denoted by dx. Okay. So the change in x is denoted by dx, and change in y, it will be dy. Okay. So for a very infinitely small change in x, or a little bit of change in x, what will be the change in y? The change in y we denote as dy, and change in x we denote by dx. And then we find out the dy by dx. Finding out this value is called differentiation. So I have some equation or some curve, and I'm trying to find out what is the change in the value of y given a very small change in x. That process is called differentiation. Okay. So if you go to your high school mathematics, differentiation and integration, these were the two most important things that you would have learned in calculus. Now, just to revisit, what is differentiation? Is that on a given curve, if I move by a very little amount or value on the x-axis, what will be the change in the y-axis? And that is what the dy by dx denotes. Now, you would also will not use that much of an integration in our data science and machine learning, but still, since we will be talking about differentiation, we will just revisit the signs that we use in integration. This is normally you use the sign in the integration, which is nothing but a prolonged s, and s is used for sum of. Okay, so the integration of dx, if you say, it is nothing but finding out the sum of all the small changes that you do in x. So if we say integration of dx, it means nothing but find out the sum of all the small changes that can happen in x. That is how the just to revisit some of the terms that you may have learned in calculus, but we are not going to use integration. We'll just limit ourselves to differentiation. And differentiation is finding the change in the value of y with a very little bit of change in x. So if we go back to the previous one, if we are at 2, and if we just move a very small amount, infinitely small amount, what would be change in y? And then we take the change in y, divide that by change in x. That is what the slope or gradient of this line would be at this given point. And why we are saying at this given point? Because that value would go on changing across along the curve. Okay. So we will revisit this concept in our discussion of the gradient descent, and I'll come back to you tomorrow on what was going wrong in defining the class, why it was not accepting the variable. So these are the things that we'll continue with tomorrow. But for today's session, any questions? Whenever one of you asks the questions, I feel happy that at least somebody is trying to understand it. So one of you could confirm to me that whether you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll end the session and we'll resume tomorrow. Okay, so if there are no questions, then we'll end the session and we'll resume tomorrow. Thank you.